Hi, I'm Professor David Kraemer, and I'm here to share some words about the stories we tell about Hanukkah. I'm sure that you, like I, have a story that you were taught about Hanukkah way back when. The first story was probably something about the miracle of lights, oil that was enough only for a single day, but which lasted 8 days. And in commemoration of that, we light candles for 8 days. You may have heard other stories besides, but it turns out that the question of the stories of Hanukkah is very, very complicated. And it's worth going back to consider what those stories have been for reasons that I will share with you as we go forward. The first story we have about Hanukkah is a story preserved in the introduction to the second book of Maccabees. Let me be clear what I mean about stories here. I'm actually talking about stories, all of which are interpretations. So the earliest records we have of the stories of Hanukkah are two books, First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. And though they overlap in some of their details, they clearly proceed to represent the events in very, very different ways. They're not sequential books, like, say, the biblical books of 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings. They are books that, again, approach the story from a different perspective. But in the case of 2nd Maccabees, which is where I'd like to begin, we've also got an interpretation of the story that comes before the book actually begins to tell the story. And so when we look at the first couple of chapters of 2nd Maccabees, the introduction, as I just called it, we've got the following. I will share it with you. You'll see it on your screen. It begins with an epistle, a message from Jews living in Jerusalem to their brothers and sisters in Egypt. And it says, "May God prosper you, remembering the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his faithful servants. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will," and so forth. It begins, in other words, with a prayer, a blessing from the Jews in Jerusalem to the Jews in Egypt. Thereafter, it begins to specify what the book that will follow is all about. And so the message continues. "During the reign of Demetrius in the year 169 of the Hellenistic counting, we Jews wrote to you as follows," quote, "In the extremity of trouble that befell us in the years after Jason," these are the events leading to the Maccabean Revolt, "and his associates had betrayed the Holy Land and kingdom, burning down the temple gateway and shedding innocent blood, we prayed to the Lord and were then heard." So reference to the events that we will read about in the book we now know of as 2nd Maccabees. But then something interesting happens. So again, this is still the introduction. It's still the message from Jerusalem to Egypt. And we then offered a sacrifice with wheat flour. We lit the lamps and we set out the loaves, as you would do in a repurified temple. "And now," they go on to say, "we recommend you too to keep the Feast of Shelters in the month of Kislev in the year 188. Now, what is the Feast of Shelters? If you translate that in your minds back to Hebrew, you'll immediately recognize that what's being referred to here is the holiday we call Sukkot. In other words, the Jews in Jerusalem are saying to their brethren in Egypt that this holiday is a celebration of Sukkot, not at its biblically defined time, but in the month of Kislev, that is to say, the month during which we celebrate what we call Hanukkah. They go on. "As we shall be celebrating the purification of the temple on the 25th of Kislev," again, what we call Hanukkah, "we consider it proper to notify you so that you too may celebrate it as you do the Feast of Shelters and the fire that appeared when Nehemiah, the builder of the temple and the altar, offered sacrifice." Now something's going on here. To begin with, The celebration that occurs on the 25th of Kislev is clearly identified as a celebration of Sukkot, the holiday that could not be celebrated the original year of these events because the temple still was in a state of impurity. But now we go on to see that the holiday is also associated with fire. That's a familiar reference for us. But that the fire is associated not with the miracle of Hanukkah as we know it, but instead with the biblical figure of Nehemiah, that is to say, of the pair Ezra and Nehemiah, each of whom has a book named after them in the Hebrew Bible. And Nehemiah is identified here as the builder of the temple and the altar, which is clearly part of the history conveyed in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now they go on and tell a story. And the story, unless you've read this before, is in certain respects familiar, but in other ways very, very unexpected. So I'll share some of it with you. I read, "For when our ancestors were being deported to Persia," this is the original exile, the Babylonian exile, "the devout priests of the time took some of the fire from the altar and hid it secretly in a hole like a dry well, where they concealed it in such a way that the place was unknown to anyone." So echo of what we know of as the Hanukkah miracle story, but already different in certain small details. Then it goes on, "When some years had passed," some years had elapsed, "in God's good name, Nehemiah, commissioned by the king of Persia, sent the descendants of the priests who had hidden the fire to look for it. When they reported that, in fact, they had found not fire, but a thick liquid, Nehemiah ordered them to draw out and bring it back. When they had done this, Nehemiah ordered the priests to pour this liquid over the sacrificial materials, that is, the wood and what lay on it. When this had been done, and when in due course the sun, which had previously been clouded over, shone out, a great fire flared up to the astonishment of all. While the sacrifice was being burned, the priests offered prayer, Jonathan intoning with all the priests, and the rest responding with Nehemiah." The story goes on a bit, but just to focus on what we've just heard, this is a light miracle of sorts. It is the light or the fire, not even of the temple's menorah, of the candelabrum, and certainly not the miracle of a small amount being translated, extended into 8 days. Instead, what we see here is an oil, a fire that was no longer ready to be lit so that it could be used at the altar in the temple. A miracle is worked. This thick liquid is poured out on the altar and what has been laid upon it. And with the sun emerging, the sun ignites this material, and the fire that's needed for the sacrifice, the consumption, is there for all to witness. And so the service proceeds. If you're attuned to biblical stories, this is not only an echo of the Hanukkah story, though with very significant differences. It is also a clear echo of the miracle that was worked by Elijah on Mount Carmel when Elijah was demonstrating the truth of the God of Israel against the prophets of Baal, and a similar such miracle on the altar, in that case with the spreading out of water around the altar, which would, of course, make ignition difficult, and its miraculous flaming. When did this happen? At the time of Nehemiah, who was, according to the biblical history, with Ezra at the foundation of the rededication of Jerusalem and of the temple within it. And so, according to this introduction, what's the meaning of Hanukkah? It is, to begin with, a celebration of the great annual pilgrimage festival, Sukkot, the Hajj, as it was called in ancient Hebrew, just as it would subsequently be called in Arabic for the great Muslim pilgrimage. But it is in addition a recollection of the dedication of the temple and the sacrifices for that dedication at the time of Nehemiah. This isn't a Maccabean miracle, it's an ancient miracle which is now celebrated also in connection to the new dedication of the temple after it had been purified following its degradation at the hands of the Greeks, now under the Maccabees. It's a very different interpretation of what we know of as Hanukkah. It changes its shape in very significant ways. There are, by the way, remainders of this even in our current practice. You'll note that Hanukkah is 8 days, not because of a Hanukkah miracle the way we know the story, according to this, but because it is meant to recreate Sukkot, and Sukkot is the only biblical festival that goes on for 8 days. The 8 days is a recollection of Sukkot. It's a dedication festival. That's Nehemiah. This is story number 1. There are, of course, many other stories of Hanukkah, some of which are ancient and some modern. So let's follow it through and see how the story changes, how its interpretation changes, and how the emphasis of each story conveys a different message. So here I go on to what is probably the most familiar story of Hanukkah, but I'm going to share it with you in the version that it appears in the Talmud. I'm quite sure that there are many of you who have heard this before, but it's worth going back to. This is not my translation, so I may make some modifications as I read it. What is Hanukkah, concerning which the sages taught? On the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. One may not eulogize on them, one may not fast on them. This is a day, in other words, that is dedicated to celebration. Why? For when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary. Okay, so that's the overlap with what we saw before, but of course it's not precisely the same. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame and emerged victorious over them, over the Greeks, they searched and found only one cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest. In other words, it was still pure. It wasn't ritually impure. And there was a sufficient oil there to light the menorah for only 1 day. A miracle occurred, and they lit from it 8 days. The next year, the sages instituted those days and made them holidays with the recitation of Hallel, the Hallel Psalms, and special thanksgiving in the festival that we know of as Hanukkah. Now, what's the emphasis here? I'm not asking what the story is. The story is the story of miracle that we all know. But what's the emphasis? If we read it again, and I'm not going to do that, but if you think about it in your head, I think you'll agree that it's fair to say the emphasis is the miracle. It was supposed to be 1 day, and it continued for 8 days. How do such miracles occur? Clearly, they require divine intervention because by natural law, a cruse containing oil for only 1 day would not continue for 8 days. So it's only through this divine intervention in the miracle of the lights that what is described here could happen at all. Now let's compare. The first story, or the interpretation that came at the beginning of 2nd Maccabees, was about recovering Sukkot because it hadn't been celebrated the first year. It was about a miracle at the altar which was confirmed by reference to the great events of the prophet Elijah at Mount Carmel. There's overlap with this, but also slightly different emphasis. This is about divine intervention in the specific miracle of the lights at the temple. What about the next story? This was the Talmudic version of the rabbi's story, but we preserve another version of the rabbi's story in the prayer that is recited. This is a rabbinic piece of writing. The liturgy is rabbinic liturgy. So when we have an added paragraph in our prayers that we recite during Hanukkah, the weekday prayer, Sabbath prayer, morning, afternoon, and evening, that special paragraph is in fact an alternative rabbinic interpretation of the meaning of Hanukkah. So it begins with the general, which we say both for Hanukkah and for Purim, right? We thank you for the miracles, the redemption, the mighty deeds, and so forth. That's generic for the two holidays. But then we get into what we recite during the prayer itself. And it's very different than what the rabbis say in the Talmudic version. So here in the prayer version, in the days of Matityahu, son of Yochanan the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the evil Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and to turn them away from the statutes of your will, you in your abundant mercy stood by them in their time of distress. You defended their cause. You judged their grievances. You avenged them. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, defiled people into the hands of the undefiled, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the insolent into the hands of diligent students of your Torah, and you made yourself a great and sanctified name in your world. It goes on a little bit, but I'm going to stay with this because this is the center of what the prayer version of the rabbi's story says. This is a very, very different story. You'll note there is no battle in the Talmud's version of this. There is no religious oppression mentioned in the Talmud's version of this. In the Talmud, as we just saw, it's simply about the miracle that is brought about by divine intervention. Now here there's divine intervention as well. That's clear. But the focus is one that's very, very different. So first of it all, it is about oppression. The Greeks, the evil ones, oppressing the Jews, the righteous ones who recognize the true God, and the need for those who are smaller but righteous, who are less powerful but righteous, who understand the truth, though they don't have the power to defend themselves against those who don't have the truth. And through another kind of divine intervention, the Maccabees, small in number, are able with divine force. It's not about their power. Note, it is about the power of God, are able to defeat the Greeks, to push them aside, to recapture the temple, and to reinstitute the temple service, which can then be celebrated in Hanukkah. Again, this is clearly divine intervention, but it's a very different sort of miracle indeed. Instead of a miracle of the lights, this is a miracle of divine power and divine judgment. I don't think we would describe the lights miracle as a miracle of power or judgment. Those elements aren't to be seen. Here, God's power is expressed. It's kind of like God's power is expressed in the Exodus from Egypt. And God's judgment is expressed because there's something wrong in the world when those who are wicked oppress, subdue those who are righteous. The issue of theodicy. How can God permit this to happen? Well, lo and behold, for the short period, God did permit it to happen, but then God renders judgment, and those who are righteous are brought back to their proper place, and those who are wicked are put in their proper place. Very, very different story indeed. Interestingly, while we know both stories, we are taught, at least most of us, I think it's fair to say, are first taught the story of the miracle of the lights. What's interesting is that the version of the story that's most repeated traditionally, simply because it appears in all of the prayers, is the one that I just read. Now, as we can see here, stories change. And the changing of stories has a point. Every time we tell a story and we recount it in a slightly different version, sometimes we realize we're doing that. Often, perhaps most often, we don't realize that we're introducing changes into the story. But the record of all traditions around the globe, oral traditions in particularly, but not only, the record of Jewish tradition in its various versions shows that these stories change from time to time and from place to place. And we can almost always understand them in one way or another as a reflection of the issues that the people who are retelling them are confronting. What are our issues? Not what was the true historical reality, because none of these stories is about a true historical reality. The story is told in order to teach a lesson, even if the storyteller isn't always conscious of what that lesson might be. So I'm going to now share two modern versions of the story, both of which I'm sure you've heard at least in passing, and ask what is the difference between these two. So I have here a very brief version. We could expand upon this considerably, of a Zionist retelling of the story of Hanukkah. What I'm going to read to you here comes from the website My Jewish Learning, and it is written by a rabbi who actually has relations with JTS from a variety of past endeavors, Rabbi Peretz Rodman, who writes as follows. He talks, first of all, in the ways the modern Zionists, that's redundant, but just so that we understand that Zionism is a modern movement, the modern Zionist description of Hanukkah emphasized very different things than the traditional version did. So he talks about the shift to emphasis on strength and the body, the image that would be a model for modern Zionists of not the Jew of the yeshiva, not the Jew of the mind, of the head of the synagogue or the Beit Midrash, but the Jew of the land. And so he talks about what he describes as transvaluations. And in doing this, he comes to a story that we all, a song that we all know, but which we probably don't recognize the radical quality of. Because for us, it's just a traditional Hanukkah song. It could not be further from traditional. It's Mi Malel, Gvurot, etc. You'll pardon me for my voice. So he writes here, the lyrics of the popular Hanukkah song Mi Malel were written by one of the creators of Hebrew folk music in the early 20th century, someone named Menashe Ravina, 1899 to 1968. He begins by reworking the verse from Psalms, who can recount the mighty acts of the Lord, right? Mi Yimalel Gvurot Hashem, into who can recount the mighty acts of Israel, the people Israel. Mi Yimalel Gvurot Yisrael, and then goes on and continues. In every generation, the song goes, a hero arises, Redeemer of Israel, Goel Yisrael, coming from the people, not from God. From a traditional perspective, this is absolutely outrageous. The only Goel, as far as traditional Judaism is concerned, even though there might be an instrument employed in the Geula and the redemption, but the Goel is God, and this is repeated in prayer over and over again. What the song does is eliminate God and emphasize that this is a secular human movement. God and God's power have been removed, and the refocus is on the power of the people. And so Rodman goes on, praise of God is yielded to praise of military victors. The title of Redeemer is now applied to the human rescuer, not a divine one. It will not be by a miraculous divine intervention that the Jews are delivered from repeated persecution and exile, claims the songwriter. Using the Maccabees as his model, he advocates that the Jewish people take their fate into their own hands, and rather than responding with flight, adaption, or martyrdom, which in the Zionist view is the diaspora Jews' way, instead takes up arms against their oppressors. This is about offering Maccabees a Hanukkah that is a Zionist event, the exhibition of strength and power on the part of the people Israel and not their God. What's the American version of this? If you will, a diaspora version. That version, I think it's easy to describe. It's about religious oppression and freedom therefrom. Jews living in diasporas have experienced all too often through history religious oppression. And America, though it has not always lived up to this, is founded on principles of freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, religious freedom. And so American Jews have celebrated Hanukkah mostly by telling it as a story of freedom of religion, that we are free to live and to believe and to practice as we desire, free as Jews in a free land. Now, what happens when the stories of old don't work for us quite anymore? Right? For Jews living in America, I think it's fair to say that the Zionist story won't work because we actually live in diaspora, and while we may support the images of the Zionist vision, at the same time, we also support our diaspora tradition with its learning and its culture and many, many other things. At the same time, Jews do not feel religiously oppressed in this country. Yes, of course, there is anti-Semitism, and we should always be conscious of that and fight against it, but we are religiously free. And so what version of the Hanukkah story do we tell? I would say that my version, and you, of course, should formulate your own version. My version is a story about taking the common and rendering it sacred, because the Hanukkah lights began not with a Chanukiah, not with a special dedicated Hanukkah lamp. If we go back to the Mishnah and the Talmud, it's about taking common oil lamps and lining them up at a particular time in a particular way, and reciting blessings and advertising the miracle of Hanukkah. Take the common and render it holy. For me, that is a principle of Jewish life in diaspora modern America. Take the common and render it holy. I hope that resonates with you, but if you need another story, I invite you to formulate it yourselves. This kind of approach, comparing stories, being critical about them, recognizing that we have different traditions in our tradition and that they all carry meaning, that is the nature of study and teaching here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. It is why it has been my home for so many years, and why I celebrate it with my students, why we learn the way we do. And if you think there is meaning to this way of addressing our tradition, yielding new meanings in not only old stories but new, I invite you to contribute, because with your support we can continue to create the new on the foundation of the old. Happy Hanukkah.